Sarah Martinez wiped the sweat from her forehead as she organized medical supplies in the corner of the field tent. The desert heat was unbearable, even in the early morning hours. Around her, soldiers moved with purpose, checking equipment and reviewing maps. Most barely noticed the small, quiet woman who kept to herself in the medical corner of their temporary base. At 24, Sarah looked even younger. Her dark hair was always pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore the same dusty uniform as everyone else. She never spoke unless spoken to, never joined the evening conversations around the small campfire, and never complained about anything. The other soldiers had nicknamed her Mouse because she moved so quietly and seemed to disappear into the background. What they didn't know was that Sarah had been through 3 years of intensive medical training before joining this unit. She had studied battlefield medicine, trauma surgery, and emergency response. Her quiet nature wasn't shyness, it was focus. She was always watching, always learning, always preparing for the moment when her skills would be needed. The base camp was located in a remote area where their unit was conducting reconnaissance missions. It was supposed to be a safe zone, far from enemy activity. The soldiers had grown comfortable with their routine. They would go out on patrols during the day and return to share stories and play cards in the evening. Sarah would clean and restock her medical supplies, study her field manuals by flashlight, and practice procedures in her mind. Sergeant Williams, the unit's unofficial leader in the absence of their commanding officer, often watched Sarah with curiosity. He had tried several times to include her in conversations, but she would just nod politely and return to her work. The other soldiers found her strange, but Williams sensed there was more to the quiet medic than met the eye. "She's probably homesick," Private Johnson said one evening as they watched Sarah reading alone by the supply tent. "My sister gets like that sometimes, just goes quiet and keeps to herself." "Maybe," Williams replied, but he wasn't convinced. There was something in Sarah's eyes when she looked at injured soldiers during their minor medical calls. She had an intensity that spoke of deep knowledge and preparation. The truth was that Sarah came from a family of doctors. Her father was a trauma surgeon, her mother a nurse, and her older brother was completing his residency in emergency medicine. She had grown up around medical discussions, had volunteered in hospitals since she was 16, and had seen more real medical emergencies than most soldiers twice her age. But Sarah had joined the military for a different reason than most. She wanted to serve where medical help was needed most desperately, where her skills could save lives in the most challenging conditions possible. She had specifically requested assignment to a forward unit, knowing that field medics often faced situations that would test every aspect of their training. The remote location of their base meant that if anything serious happened, they would be on their own. The nearest hospital was over 200 miles away, and helicopter evacuation wasn't always possible due to the rough terrain and unpredictable weather. Sarah understood this better than anyone, which was why she spent every free moment preparing. Her medical kit was more comprehensive than standard issue. She had traded personal items for extra supplies, had written to medical contacts back home for advice on desert medicine, and had even practiced procedures using training dummies she had improvised from spare clothing and equipment. At night, when others slept, she would quiz herself on symptoms, treatment protocols, and emergency procedures. The other soldiers saw her reading and studying, but they assumed she was writing letters home or reading novels. They had no idea she was memorizing the locations of major arteries, studying the effects of heat stroke and dehydration, and learning advanced trauma techniques that most field medics never needed to use. Captain Rodriguez, their commanding officer, was currently away at headquarters receiving new orders. In his absence, the soldiers had become more relaxed about security protocols. They still conducted their assigned patrols, but the atmosphere in camp had become almost casual. Sarah noticed this change and felt a growing sense of unease. Her medical training had taught her to trust her instincts, and something felt wrong. The local intelligence reports had been inconsistent. Radio communications from other units had been spotty, and there had been several unexplained equipment malfunctions over the past week. While the other soldiers attributed these issues to the harsh desert conditions, Sarah wondered if there might be other explanations. She had started keeping her medical kit fully stocked and ready at all times. She had also begun discreet preparations for mass casualty situations, organizing supplies in a way that would allow for rapid response to multiple serious injuries. She told herself she was being overly cautious, but her instincts kept telling her to be ready for anything. The night before everything changed, Sarah lay in her sleeping bag listening to the sounds of the camp settling down for the night. Private Chen was on watch duty, and she could hear him humming quietly to himself as he walked the perimeter. The desert was surprisingly noisy at night, with wind whistling through the rocks and small animals scurrying in the brush. As she drifted off to sleep, Sarah's last conscious thought was a mental review of her emergency procedures. She had no way of knowing that in less than 12 hours, those procedures would be the only thing standing between her unit and complete disaster. The quiet girl who nobody really noticed was about to face the greatest test of her life, and her response would change how everyone saw her forever. The stage was set for a day that would prove that sometimes the most important people are the ones who work quietly in the background, preparing for moments when everything depends on their knowledge, skill, and courage. The attack came without warning at 0630 hours, just as the morning patrol was preparing to leave camp. Sarah was checking her medical supplies when the first explosion shattered the desert silence. The blast was so powerful it knocked her to the ground and sent equipment flying across the tent. Contact! Contact! Private Chen's voice crackled over the radio before it went silent. Sarah could hear gunfire erupting from multiple directions around the camp perimeter. Through the tent opening, she saw soldiers scrambling for cover as bullets whistled overhead. Sergeant Williams was shouting orders, trying to organize a defense, but it was clear they had been caught completely off guard. The attack was coordinated and overwhelming. Sarah could see muzzle flashes from at least 3 different positions surrounding their camp, and the enemy had clearly been planning this assault for some time. Another explosion rocked the camp, this one closer to the main tent. Sarah felt the ground shake beneath her as she grabbed her medical kit and tried to assess the situation. Through the chaos, she could hear soldiers calling for help, but the volume of incoming fire made it impossible for anyone to move safely across the open areas of the camp. Medic. We need a medic. The call came from near the communication tent, where she could see 2 soldiers dragging a third toward cover behind a supply truck. Even from a distance, Sarah could tell from the way they were moving that someone was badly injured. The rational part of her mind told her to stay in cover, to wait for the firefight to end before attempting any medical treatment. But her training and instincts overrode rational thought. She had prepared for exactly this type of situation, and soldiers needed help now, not after the shooting stopped. Sarah low-crawled to the edge of her tent and studied the battlefield. The enemy positions were well concealed in the rocky outcroppings that surrounded their camp. Her unit was pinned down in 3 separate groups, unable to coordinate their defense effectively. She could see Private Martinez clutching his shoulder behind the motor pool, Corporal Hayes lying motionless near the radio equipment, and at least 2 other soldiers who appeared to be wounded. Taking a deep breath, Sarah made her decision. She grabbed her medical kit, slung it across her shoulder, and began moving toward the nearest wounded soldier. She used every piece of cover available, timing her movements between bursts of enemy fire, staying low and moving fast. The first soldier she reached was Private Martinez. He had taken a bullet through his upper arm and was losing blood rapidly. His face was pale with shock and his breathing was shallow and rapid. Sarah immediately applied pressure to the wound while assessing his condition. "You're going to be okay," she told him in a calm, steady voice that surprised both of them. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency as she cleaned the wound and applied a pressure bandage. "The bullet went through cleanly. You'll be back to annoying everyone in no time." Martinez stared at her in amazement. This was the quiet girl who barely spoke to anyone, but now she was working with the confidence and skill of an experienced battlefield surgeon. Her voice was steady, her movements precise, and she seemed completely unaffected by the bullets flying around them. "How did you—" Martinez started to ask, but Sarah was already preparing to move to the next casualty. "Stay here and keep pressure on that bandage," she ordered. "I'll be back to check on you." The next wounded soldier was Corporal Hayes, and his situation was much more serious. He had been caught in the blast of the second explosion, and had multiple injuries including a head wound, possible internal bleeding, and what appeared to be a broken leg. He was unconscious and barely breathing. Sarah worked quickly, checking his airway and stabilizing his neck. She could hear Sergeant Williams coordinating the defense somewhere behind her, but she blocked out everything except the medical emergency in front of her. Hayes needed immediate attention or he would die within minutes. Using techniques she had practiced hundreds of times but never performed under fire, Sarah inserted an airway tube and began treating his most critical injuries. She worked with a level of skill and confidence that seemed impossible for someone so young and inexperienced. Private Johnson, who was providing covering fire from nearby, watched in disbelief as Sarah performed complex medical procedures while bullets struck the ground around her. She never flinched, never hesitated, and never stopped working. It was like watching a completely different person than the quiet, shy medic they all thought they knew. "Williams," Johnson called out. "You need to see this. She's incredible." But Williams was busy trying to coordinate their defense and couldn't spare attention for anything else. The enemy fire was intensifying, and it was becoming clear that they were outnumbered and outgunned. Their only hope was to hold out until reinforcements arrived, but their radio was damaged and they had no way to call for help. Sarah stabilized Hayes and moved on to the next casualty. Each wounded soldier she treated stared at her with the same expression of amazement. Where had this quiet, unremarkable medic learned to work with such skill and confidence? How was she staying so calm under fire when everyone else was fighting panic? As she worked, Sarah's mind was operating on multiple levels. Part of her consciousness was focused entirely on medical procedures, drawing on years of training and study. Another part was constantly assessing the tactical situation, looking for opportunities to reach other wounded soldiers and planning her next moves. She had already treated 4 seriously wounded soldiers, and the firefight was still raging. The enemy seemed determined to overrun their position, and her unit's ammunition was running low. Sarah realized that medical treatment might not be enough to save her fellow soldiers. They needed a miracle, and she was beginning to understand that she might be the only one capable of providing it. The quiet girl who had spent months being overlooked and underestimated was about to prove that still waters run deep, and that sometimes the most unassuming people are capable of the most extraordinary things when the situation demands it. As the firefight continued into its second hour, Sarah had transformed from the unit's quiet medic into their lifeline. She had successfully treated 6 wounded soldiers, moving between casualties with a skill and courage that left everyone who witnessed it speechless. But she knew that medical treatment alone wouldn't save them if they couldn't break out of their desperate situation. The enemy had them surrounded and was methodically closing in. Their ammunition was running dangerously low, and several soldiers were too badly wounded to fight effectively. Sergeant Williams was doing his best to coordinate their defense, but even he was beginning to show signs of desperation. That's when Sarah noticed something that everyone else had missed. During her movements around the battlefield, she had observed the enemy's attack pattern. They were concentrating their fire from 3 main positions, but there was a gap in their coverage on the eastern side of the camp. More importantly, she had spotted what appeared to be their command position on a ridge about 400 meters away. "Sergeant Williams," Sarah called out during a brief lull in the firing. "I need to talk to you." Williams low-crawled over to her position behind the supply truck. His face was grim, and Sarah could see the weight of command wearing on him. He was responsible for these soldiers' lives, and the situation was deteriorating rapidly. "What is it, Martinez?" he asked, using her last name in the military tradition. "I've been watching their positions," Sarah said quietly. "They have a weakness on the eastern perimeter, and I think I know where their command post is located." William stared at her in surprise. "You've been doing tactical reconnaissance while treating casualties?" "My father always said that doctors need to understand the whole situation, not just the immediate problem," Sarah replied. "I think there might be a way to turn this around, but it's going to require taking a big risk." She quickly outlined what she had observed: the gap in enemy coverage, the likely location of their command post, and most importantly, her assessment of their enemy's tactical mindset. They were fighting like a well-trained unit, but they were also overconfident. They had expected an easy victory against an unprepared target. "What are you suggesting?" Williams asked, though he was beginning to suspect he wouldn't like the answer. "Someone needs to get through that gap and take out their command post," Sarah said. "If we can disrupt their coordination, it might give us the opening we need to break out of this trap." "Absolutely not," Williams replied immediately. "You're our medic. We can't risk losing you on some kind of suicide mission." But Sarah had already thought through all the arguments. "Look around, Sergeant. Half our unit is wounded, you're running out of ammunition, and the enemy is closing in. In another hour, we'll all be dead or captured. Someone has to try something different." "Then I'll go," Williams said. "Or Johnson or Chen. Anyone but our medic. Sarah shook her head. You're needed here to coordinate the defense. Johnson and Chen don't have the medical training to treat themselves if they get wounded during the mission, and honestly, I'm probably the best choice because I'm the one person the enemy won't expect. Williams wanted to argue further, but deep down he knew she was right. They were out of good options, and Sarah's plan was their only hope. Still, the idea of sending their quiet young medic on a dangerous solo mission felt wrong on every level. There's something else, Sarah continued. I haven't been completely honest about my background. My medical training is more extensive than my file indicates. I've had additional tactical training that isn't in my official record. This was only partially true. Sarah had indeed received more medical training than most field medics, but her tactical knowledge came from years of listening to her father's stories about his time as a combat medic in an earlier conflict. She had also studied military tactics as part of understanding battlefield medicine, but she had never actually applied that knowledge in combat. However, she spoke with such confidence that Williams found himself believing her. More importantly, he was running out of alternatives. The enemy fire was intensifying again, and he could see movement that suggested they were preparing for a final assault. If you're going to do this, you'll need support, Williams finally said. Johnson and Chen can create a diversion on the western side to draw their attention away from your route. Sarah nodded. Give me 10 minutes to prepare, then start the diversion. I'll signal you when I'm in position. As Williams crawled away to brief the others, Sarah took a moment to truly understand what she was about to attempt. She was planning to leave the relative safety of the camp, cross several hundred meters of open desert while under enemy observation, infiltrate their command position, and somehow disrupt their attack coordination. It was exactly the kind of mission that trained Special Forces soldiers spent months preparing for. But Sarah had advantages that even Special Forces soldiers sometimes lacked. Her medical training had taught her to remain calm under extreme pressure, to make life-or-death decisions quickly, and to function effectively when everything around her was chaotic. Her quiet nature meant she was naturally good at moving without attracting attention, and most importantly, she had spent months observing and learning about each member of her unit, which meant she understood better than anyone what they were capable of and what they needed from her. She checked her medical kit one final time, making sure she had supplies to treat any wounds she might sustain during the mission. Then she reviewed the route she had planned, visualizing each piece of cover and each potential obstacle. She thought about her family back home, particularly her father, who had always told her that the best doctors were the ones who were willing to take calculated risks to save lives. As she prepared to leave the safety of the camp, Sarah realized that this moment would define not just the rest of her military service, but the rest of her life. The quiet girl who had spent months being overlooked was about to find out what she was truly capable of when everything was on the line. Sarah waited until she heard the diversionary gunfire from the western side of the camp, then began her movement toward the eastern perimeter. Every instinct told her this was insane, but her analytical mind kept working through the tactical problem step by step. She had identified a route that would take her through a series of rocky outcroppings and dried creek beds, providing cover for most of the journey to the enemy command position. The first 100 meters were the most dangerous. She had to cross an open area where she would be visible to enemy positions if they happened to be looking in her direction. Sarah timing her movement carefully, waiting for a moment when the enemy fire was concentrated on the diversion, then sprinting across the open ground in a low crouch. She made it to the first rocky outcropping without being spotted, and paused to catch her breath and reassess the situation. From this position, she could see the enemy command post more clearly. It was located on a ridge overlooking the camp, with what appeared to be 3 or 4 soldiers operating radio equipment and coordinating the attack. They had chosen their position well. It provided excellent visibility of the battlefield while being difficult to assault directly. But Sarah had noticed something during her observation. The command post was positioned to watch the main camp, which meant their attention was focused downward and away from the approach route she was using. If she could reach a position directly behind them, she might be able to get close enough to disrupt their operations before they realized she was there. The next phase of her movement took her through a dried creek bed that wound around the base of the ridge. The going was difficult, with loose rocks that threatened to create noise and unstable ground that made quiet movement challenging. Sarah drew on everything she had learned about moving carefully during her medical training. when she had often needed to approach patients without disturbing their condition. Halfway to her objective, she heard voices speaking in a language she didn't recognize. Enemy soldiers were moving somewhere above her position, and she realized that they had sentries posted along the ridge. Sarah froze, pressing herself against the wall of the creek bed and controlling her breathing to minimize any sound. The voices grew closer and she could hear footsteps on the rocky ground above her head. 2 soldiers were walking along the ridge, probably conducting a routine patrol of their perimeter. Sarah remained perfectly still, knowing that any movement could give away her position and doom not only her mission, but potentially her entire unit. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the voices faded as the patrol moved away. Sarah waited several more minutes to be certain they were gone, then continued her movement toward the command post. The creek bed ended about 50 meters from her target, which meant she would have to cover the final distance across open ground. From her new position, she could see the enemy command post clearly. 4 soldiers were operating radio equipment and coordinating the attack on her unit. They seemed confident and relaxed, obviously expecting an easy victory. Maps were spread out in front of them, and she could see radio handsets and what appeared to be sophisticated communication equipment. Sarah studied the position carefully, looking for weaknesses and planning her approach. The command post was set up on a flat area at the top of the ridge, with good visibility in all directions except directly behind where she was positioned. The soldiers were focused on their radios and the battlefield below, not expecting any threat from their rear. But Sarah realized that simply reaching the command post wouldn't be enough. She needed to find a way to disable their communications and disrupt their coordination of the attack. She wasn't a trained saboteur, and she didn't have explosives or specialized equipment. She would have to rely on improvisation and the element of surprise. Looking through her medical kit, Sarah found several items that might be useful for her improvised sabotage mission. Medical supplies often included chemicals and tools that could be repurposed for other uses. She had alcohol for sterilization, which was flammable. She had syringes, which could be used to inject liquids into electronic equipment. And she had bandages and tape, which could be used to secure or disable equipment. More importantly, she had several emergency signal flares in her kit. These were designed to create bright, hot fires for signaling rescue aircraft. If she could deploy them effectively among the enemy's radio equipment, they might cause enough damage and confusion to disrupt the attack coordination. Sarah spent several minutes preparing her improvised sabotage kit, organizing everything she would need for quick deployment once she reached the command post. She practiced the sequence of actions she would need to perform, visualizing each step to minimize the time she would be exposed once she began her assault. The final approach to the command post required crossing 50 meters of open ground. Sarah waited for a moment when the enemy soldiers were all focused on their radio communications, then began moving forward in a low crawl. The ground was rocky and uncomfortable, but she ignored the discomfort and concentrated on moving silently. When she was within 20 meters of the command post, Sarah could hear the enemy soldiers talking among themselves and issuing commands over their radios. She couldn't understand their language, but their tone suggested they were confident and in control of the situation. They had no idea that a lone medic was approaching their position with the intention of destroying their entire operation. Sarah positioned herself directly behind the command post and prepared to make her move. She had come this far through a combination of courage, skill, and luck. Now she needed to execute the most dangerous part of her plan, getting close enough to the enemy soldiers to disable their equipment while avoiding being killed or captured in the process. The quiet girl who had spent months being overlooked was about to launch a one-person assault on an enemy command post, armed with nothing but medical supplies and determination. Success would save her unit. Failure would mean certain death. Sarah took a deep breath and prepared to find out which way her story would end. Sarah waited until she heard the diversionary gunfire from the western side of the camp, then began her movement toward the eastern perimeter. Every instinct told her this was insane, but her analytical mind kept working through the tactical problem step by step. She had identified a route that would take her through a series of rocky outcroppings and dried creek beds, providing cover for most of the journey to the enemy command position. The first 100 meters were the most dangerous. She had to cross an open area where she would be visible to enemy positions if they happened to be looking in her direction. Sarah, timing her movement carefully, waiting for a moment when the enemy fire was concentrated on the diversion, then sprinting across the open ground in a low crouch. She made it to the first rocky outcropping without being spotted, and paused to catch her breath and reassess the situation. From this position, she could see the enemy command post more clearly. It was located on a ridge overlooking the camp, with what appeared to be 3 or 4 soldiers operating radio equipment and coordinating the attack. They had chosen their position well. It provided excellent visibility of the battlefield while being difficult to assault directly. But Sarah had noticed something during her observation. The command post was positioned to watch the main camp, which meant their attention was focused downward and away from the approach route she was using. If she could reach a position directly behind them, she might be able to get close enough to disrupt their operations before they realized she was there. The next phase of her movement took her through a dried creek bed that wound around the base of the ridge. The going was difficult, with loose rocks that threatened to create noise and unstable ground that made quiet movement challenging. Sarah drew on everything she had learned about moving carefully during her medical training, when she had often needed to approach patients without disturbing their condition. Halfway to her objective, she heard voices speaking in a language she didn't recognize. Enemy soldiers were moving somewhere above her position, and she realized that they had sentries posted along the ridge. Sarah froze, pressing herself against the wall of the creek bed and controlling her breathing to minimize any sound. The voices grew closer, and she could hear footsteps on the rocky ground above her head. 2 soldiers were walking along the ridge, probably conducting a routine patrol of their perimeter. Sarah remained perfectly still, knowing that any movement could give away her position and doom not only her mission, but potentially her entire unit. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the voices faded as the patrol moved away. Sarah waited several more minutes to be certain they were gone, then continued her movement toward the command post. The creek bed ended about 50 meters from her target, which meant she would have to cover the final distance across open ground. From her new position, she could see the enemy command post clearly. 4 soldiers were operating radio equipment and coordinating the attack on her unit. They seemed confident and relaxed, obviously expecting an easy victory. Maps were spread out in front of them, and she could see radio handsets and what appeared to be sophisticated communication equipment. Sarah studied the position carefully, looking for weaknesses and planning her approach. The command post was set up on a flat area at the top of the ridge, with good visibility in all directions except directly behind where she was positioned. The soldiers were focused on their radios and the battlefield below, not expecting any threat from their rear. But Sarah realized that simply reaching the command post wouldn't be enough. She needed to find a way to disable their communications and disrupt their coordination of the attack. She wasn't a trained saboteur, and she didn't have explosives or specialized equipment. She would have to rely on improvisation and the element of surprise. Looking through her medical kit, Sarah found several items that might be useful for her improvised sabotage mission. Medical supplies often included chemicals and tools that could be repurposed for other uses. She had alcohol for sterilization, which was flammable. She had syringes, which could be used to inject liquids into electronic equipment. And she had bandages and tape, which could be used to secure or disable equipment. More importantly, she had several emergency signal flares in her kit. These were designed to create bright, hot fires for signaling rescue aircraft. If she could deploy them effectively among the enemy's radio equipment, they might cause enough damage and confusion to disrupt the attack coordination. Sarah spent several minutes preparing her improvised sabotage kit, organizing everything she would need for quick deployment once she reached the command post. She practiced the sequence of actions she would need to perform, visualizing each step to minimize the time she would be exposed once she began her assault. The final approach to the command post required crossing 50 meters of open ground. Sarah waited for a moment when the enemy soldiers were all focused on their radio communications, then began moving forward in a low crawl. The ground was rocky and uncomfortable, but she ignored the discomfort and concentrated on moving silently. When she was within 20 meters of the command post, Sarah could hear the enemy soldiers talking among themselves and issuing commands over their radios. She couldn't understand their language, but their tone suggested they were confident and in control of the situation. They had no idea that a lone medic was approaching their position with the intention of destroying their entire operation. Sarah positioned herself directly behind the command post and prepared to make her move. She had come this far through a combination of courage, skill, and luck. Now she needed to execute the most dangerous part of her plan, getting close enough to the enemy soldiers to disable their equipment while avoiding being killed or captured in the process. The quiet girl who had spent months being overlooked was about to launch a one-person assault on an enemy command post, armed with nothing but medical supplies and determination. Success would save her unit. Failure would mean certain death. Sarah took a deep breath and prepared to find out which way her story would end. Sarah moved forward in complete silence, every step calculated and controlled. When she was within 10 meters of the enemy command post, she could clearly see all 4 soldiers and their equipment layout. 3 men were actively operating radios while a 4th appeared to be their leader, studying maps and issuing orders. Their weapons were nearby but not immediately in hand, suggesting they felt secure in their position. The moment had come to act. Sarah pulled the pins on 2 emergency flares simultaneously and threw them directly into the center of the radio equipment. The flares ignited immediately, creating brilliant red light and intense heat. The enemy soldiers shouted in alarm and confusion as their expensive communication equipment began smoking and sparking. Sarah didn't wait to see the full effects of her sabotage. She immediately activated a 3rd flare and threw it at the map table where the enemy leader was standing. The sudden appearance of intense flames and smoke created complete chaos in the command post. The soldiers were shouting, trying to save their equipment, and attempting to locate the source of the attack all at the same time. Using the confusion to her advantage, Sarah grabbed several radio handsets and threw them down the rocky slope behind the command post. Then she emptied her alcohol supplies onto the remaining electronic equipment and ignited it with a 4th flare. Within seconds, the entire command post was filled with smoke and flames. The enemy leader finally spotted Sarah and shouted a warning to his men while reaching for his weapon. But Sarah had anticipated this moment and was already moving. She used her medical knowledge of human anatomy to her advantage, striking pressure points and using techniques she had learned for restraining agitated patients. What followed was not a traditional military engagement, but rather a chaotic struggle between Sarah's medical training, improvised tactics, and desperate determination against 4 confused and disorganized enemy soldiers. Sarah had no formal combat training, but she had spent years learning how to move quickly in crisis situations, how to think clearly under pressure, and how to make split-second decisions when lives were at stake. The enemy soldiers were handicapped by the smoke and flames from their burning equipment and by their complete surprise at being attacked by a lone soldier. They had been trained to respond to conventional military assaults, not to deal with a medic, using medical supplies as weapons and improvised tactics based on healthcare procedures. Sarah managed to disable 2 of the radio operators using pressure point techniques and improvised restraints made from medical bandages. The 3rd soldier was overcome by smoke inhalation from the burning equipment and collapsed before he could mount an effective response. The enemy leader presented the greatest threat, but he was also the most distracted by the destruction of his command capabilities. The entire engagement lasted less than 5 minutes, but it felt like hours to Sarah. When the smoke finally began to clear, she found herself in control of the enemy command post with 4 disabled soldiers and completely destroyed communication equipment. She could hardly believe what she had accomplished. Looking down at the battlefield below, Sarah could see that the loss of command coordination was already having dramatic effects on the enemy attack. Without central direction, the 3 enemy positions were fighting independently and ineffectively. Her unit was beginning to mount a coordinated counterattack, taking advantage of the enemy's confusion and disorganization. Sarah used one of the few remaining functional radios to contact Sergeant Williams. "This is Martinez. The command post is secure. Repeat, the command post is secure. Enemy communications are destroyed." Williams's voice crackled back over the radio, filled with disbelief and excitement. "Martinez, is that really you? How did you—" "Never mind, we'll talk about it later. Can you provide observation and guidance for our counterattack from your position?" From her elevated position on the ridge, Sarah had an excellent view of the entire battlefield. She could see enemy positions that were invisible to her unit below, and she could coordinate their movements to maximum advantage. For the next hour, the quiet medic who had never fired a shot in anger became the tactical coordinator for a successful counterattack that completely routed the enemy force. When the last enemy soldier had either fled or been captured, Sarah made her way back down to the camp. The soldiers who had known her as the quiet, unremarkable medic stared at her with a mixture of amazement, respect, and disbelief. She was covered in smoke residue and dust. Her uniform was torn from crawling over rocks, and she carried herself with a confidence none of them had ever seen before. Sergeant Williams met her at the perimeter of the camp. "Martinez, what you did up there. I've been in the military for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like it. Where did you learn to do all that?" Sarah smiled tiredly. "My father always said that good doctors have to be prepared for anything. I guess I took that advice more seriously than most people realized." As the unit began treating their wounded and securing the area, Sarah returned to her medical duties as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But everything had changed. The soldiers who had barely noticed her before now watched her with newfound respect and curiosity. They began to realize that they had completely misjudged the quiet girl who had been working alongside them for months. Word of Sarah's actions began to spread beyond their unit as reports were filed and stories were told. The tale of the medic who had single-handedly destroyed an enemy command post using medical supplies and improvised tactics became legendary within their military organization. But Sarah remained characteristically modest about her accomplishments, always deflecting praise and focusing on the teamwork that had made their survival possible. The quiet girl had proven that heroism doesn't always announce itself with fanfare and bravado. Sometimes the most extraordinary courage comes from ordinary people who simply do what needs to be done when everything is on the line. 3 weeks after the battle, Colonel James Harrison arrived at the forward base for what everyone assumed would be a routine inspection and debriefing. Colonel Harrison was a decorated veteran with over 20 years of military service, known for his strict adherence to protocol and his ability to assess military situations with remarkable accuracy. His presence at their remote base was unusual, and it made everyone nervous. Sarah continued her normal duties, treating minor injuries, maintaining medical supplies, and preparing for routine medical calls. The other soldiers in the unit had begun treating her differently since the battle, with obvious respect and deference that made her uncomfortable. She preferred to work quietly and efficiently, just as she always had. Colonel Harrison spent 2 days reviewing reports, interviewing soldiers, and examining the battlefield where the attack had taken place. He spoke with Sergeant Williams at length about the tactical situation and the unit's response to the enemy assault. He reviewed medical records and examined the improvised weapons and tactics that had been used during the counterattack. What Sarah didn't know was that Colonel Harrison had been specifically sent to investigate reports that seemed almost too extraordinary to believe. Multiple independent sources had described a medic who had performed battlefield surgery under heavy fire, then conducted a solo assault on an enemy command post using medical supplies as weapons. The reports were so unusual that higher command wanted verification from an experienced officer. On his final day at the base, Colonel Harrison called for a unit formation. All available soldiers gathered in the main area of the camp, wondering what announcement the colonel might make. Sarah stood in the back row, as was her habit, hoping to avoid attention. "I've spent the past 3 days reviewing what happened here during the enemy assault," Colonel Harrison began. "I've read the official reports, interviewed witnesses, and examined the physical evidence. What I've discovered is a story that challenges everything we think we know about courage, preparation, and the potential that exists in every soldier." He paused and looked directly at Sarah. "Private Martinez, would you please step forward?" Sarah felt her stomach drop. She had been hoping that the attention from the battle would fade with time, allowing her to return to her quiet, anonymous service. Being singled out by a colonel was exactly what she had been trying to avoid. "Private Martinez," Colonel Harrison continued as Sarah reluctantly moved to the front of the formation. "According to the reports I've reviewed and the witnesses I've interviewed, you performed extraordinary actions during the recent enemy assault. Is it true that you treated 6 seriously wounded soldiers while under heavy enemy fire?" "I did what any medic would do, sir," Sarah replied quietly. "I treated soldiers who needed medical attention." "And is it true that you conducted solo reconnaissance of enemy positions while performing these medical duties?" "I was observing the tactical situation to better understand how to help my unit, sir." Colonel Harrison smiled slightly. "And is it true that you conducted a single-handed assault on an enemy command post?" destroying their communications equipment using improvised weapons made from medical supplies. Sarah hesitated. The enemy command post needed to be neutralized to save the unit, sir. I was in a position to attempt the mission. Private Martinez, Colonel Harrison said, his voice carrying clearly across the formation. I have been in the military for over 20 years. I have served in multiple combat zones and have seen acts of courage that most people would consider impossible. But I have never encountered a single soldier who demonstrated such a combination of medical skill, tactical awareness, and individual courage under impossible circumstances. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. What your fellow soldiers don't know, and what you apparently didn't think was worth mentioning, is that your actions didn't just save your unit. The intelligence gathered from the enemy command post you captured led to the identification and neutralization of a much larger enemy network. Your mission disrupted enemy operations across this entire region. Sarah stared at him in surprise. She had known that documents and equipment had been recovered from the command post, but she had assumed it was routine intelligence gathering. The enemy force that attacked your unit was conducting reconnaissance for a major assault that would have targeted 3 other military installations in this area. Colonel Harrison continued. By destroying their command structure and capturing their intelligence materials, you prevented attacks that could have resulted in hundreds of casualties. He opened the small box, revealing a medal. Private Sarah Martinez, by direction of the President and the Secretary of Defense, you are hereby awarded the Silver Star for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against an enemy of the United States. Your actions demonstrated extraordinary heroism and devotion to duty that reflect great credit upon yourself and the United States Army. The assembled soldiers erupted in cheers and applause as Colonel Harrison pinned the medal to Sarah's uniform. She stood at attention, overwhelmed by the recognition and still somewhat bewildered by how her quiet service had led to this moment. But that's not all, Colonel Harrison said, raising his hand for silence. Private Martinez, you are also being recommended for immediate promotion to sergeant and for acceptance into the Army's Advanced Medical Training Program. Your combination of medical expertise, tactical awareness, and leadership under pressure represents exactly the kind of soldier our military needs in positions of greater responsibility. As the formation was dismissed and soldiers came forward to congratulate her, Sarah found herself surrounded by the same soldiers who had barely noticed her just weeks before. Private Johnson, who had called her mouse behind her back, now shook her hand with genuine respect. Private Chen, who had been on watch duty the morning of the attack, thanked her for saving his life during the medical treatment that followed the battle. Sergeant Williams approached her with a broad smile. You know, Martinez, I always suspected there was more to you than met the eye. But this is beyond anything I could have imagined. Sarah looked around at the faces of her fellow soldiers, people who had shared meals with her, slept in the same tents, and faced danger together. They were looking at her with admiration and respect, but also with curiosity. They wanted to understand how the quiet girl they had known had been capable of such extraordinary actions. The truth is, Sarah said quietly, I've always believed that the best way to serve is to be ready for whatever might happen. My family taught me that preparation and dedication matter more than recognition or attention. I never wanted to be noticed. I just wanted to be useful when it mattered most. Colonel Harrison, who had been listening to the conversation, nodded approvingly. That attitude, Sergeant Martinez, is exactly why you'll be successful in your new responsibilities. The best leaders are often the ones who never sought leadership but accepted it when duty required. Over the following days, as news of Sarah's actions spread throughout the military, requests for interviews and appearances began arriving at the base. Military newspapers wanted to write feature stories about the heroic medic. Training commands wanted her to speak to new recruits about battlefield medicine and tactical awareness. Various military schools requested her input on training programs. But Sarah declined most of these requests, preferring to focus on her duties and her soldiers. She accepted the promotion to sergeant and the opportunity for advanced medical training, but she insisted on remaining with her unit until their deployment was complete. The soldiers who had served with her during the battle had become more than fellow service members. They had become family. As her deployment neared its end, Sarah reflected on how much had changed since that morning when the enemy attack had shattered the desert silence. She had discovered capabilities within herself that she had never fully understood. More importantly, she had learned that true heroism isn't about seeking glory or recognition. It's about being prepared to act when others need you most. The night before Colonel Harrison departed, he spoke with Sarah privately about her future in the military. "You have a choice to make, Sergeant Martinez. You can continue as a medic, using your skills to save lives in the field, or you can accept a position training other medics, passing on your knowledge and experience to the next generation of soldiers. Both paths would be valuable service." Sarah considered the question carefully. "With respect, sir, I don't think those are mutually exclusive options. The best teachers are those who continue practicing their skills in real situations. I'd like to do both, serve as a medic when needed and train others when possible." Colonel Harrison smiled. "I was hoping you'd say that. There's a new program being developed for advanced battlefield medics, who can also serve as tactical advisors and training instructors. It's designed for soldiers who have demonstrated exceptional capability in both medical and leadership situations. I think you'd be perfect for it."